explains emissions from transportation account for about 27% of total U.S. greenhouse gases, making it the largest contributor. Between 1990 and 2020, greenhouse gas emissions in transportation increased more than any other sector, affirming results by decreasing oil dependency. Cassidy 22 finds that big oil has been making historic profits, and energy companies are deliberately sitting on their hands to keep prices and profits high. This expansion is detrimental, as Carrington 22 reports that the world's biggest fossil fuel firms are quietly planning scores of oil and gas projects. Specifically, oil companies are looking to the Arctic. Richard 22 finds that the Biden administration is facing a critical test about oil drilling in a vast region of the Arctic with so much crude it has been called a carbon bomb. Crucially, just the perception of decreased demand hurts the oil industry, as Kearney 22 finds that the oil plummeted about 9% in the biggest daily drop since March on growing fears of lockdowns that could slash demand. Thus, US HSRA 22 finds that a national high-speed rail system ends our oil dependency quickly and permanently. This is essential because Walsh explains that potent greenhouse gases will likely be emitted in significant amounts when drilling in the Arctic. Contention 2 is reconnection. A recession is coming. Lee 22 explains consumers show signs of crumbling under the weight of inflation with rising fear. Hoover 22 reports a host of companies have announced job cuts or hiring freezes. Thus, Inc. finds 3 weeks ago that the U.S. economy is going to fall into a recession next year. We've had 5 months of zero growth, and the Fed isn't even looking at it. However, HSR will revitalize the economy in 2 ways. First is mega regions. Currently, America's biggest cities are facing a density doomsday. After 22 finds that the U.S. population is projected to grow by 100 million in the next 40 years, creating megaregions that will not prosper unless they can be freed from congestion. With urban hubs becoming overpopulated, small cities and rural areas are de-developing. Connor 16 explains that economically and socially, the country is drifting towards metropolises, and connectivity to these urban clusters determines America's long-term economic viability. Smaller cities in America are increasingly cut off, destined to be abandoned. Luckily, HSR would fix this problem. Furuk 21 finds that people would rather live in small cities and still work in a larger city that's just 30 minutes away by train but 3 hours away by car. Kana continues that an HSR network will finally uplift America's isolated and stagnant towns by facilitating investment. Empirically, the Japanese HSR networks have decentralized development, helping small cities while making big cities more livable. Yorotani 18 finds that by making it easier for workers to move out of the city, high-speed rail shifted the demand from high-cost cities to low-cost suburbs and rural areas, helping cities to decentralize. Connecting megaregions is crucial, as Ross 11 explains. In 2050, 80% of GDP will be generated in megaregions. For economic success, adequate transportation infrastructure is imperative. Missing out on just a small part of economic growth is detrimental, as Majority 8 concludes that every 1% decline in growth traps an additional 20 million people in poverty. Second is the Rust Belt. Cruz explains that today, many of the places that were once the industrial capitals of Middle America are a shadow of their former selves, existing in a part of the world now called the Rust Belt. Part 20 furthers that U.S. manufacturing output has been flat over the last 2 decades, and the manufacturing sector recently fell into recession. Fortunately, HSR would rejuvenate the industrial heartland. Curve 10 finds that building a high-speed rail network will boost Midwest manufacturing. Firms will be reluctant to build plants without evidence of a sustained commitment to HSR. Establishing HSR could restore manufacturing jobs that the region has lost. In fact, the Hood 11 reports that 30 rail companies from around the world have pledged that if selected for HSR contracts, they will hire American workers and expand their bases of operations in Rust Belt communities. That's why ABS on 20 confirms that HSR would create 11 million new American jobs and a new manufacturing industry, including an extensive supply chain made up of thousands of specialty companies. Even better, manufacturing creates economic resilience. NAM 17 explains that for every dollar spent in manufacturing, another $1.81 is added to the economy, the highest multiplier effect of any economic sector. Indeed, the Hood 21 furthers that Chinese HSR investments help pull their economy out of the global financial crisis and create an entirely new domestic industry. Ultimately, Proc concludes that the new HSR railways will fuel our economy through the recessions of the next 50 years, which is crucial, as Boston University quantifies that in the 2008 recession alone, 100 million people from around the world fell into extreme poverty. Confirmed.
Is anybody not ready? Okay, cool. Communicate. Our sole contention is 1 step forward and 2 steps back. Although America's infrastructure was once deteriorating, recent legislation has brought that to an end. Labasco 21 of CNN finds Congress passed the $1.2 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill last summer, the single largest investment in repairing our nation's infrastructure since the interstate highway system. Touching everything from roads to broadband, the bill will reintegrate in rural America and substantially increase economic growth. These goals have moved beyond Capitol Hill. The Associated Press found in May that just 6 months in, Biden's infrastructure plan has distributed over $110 billion in funding, with much more on the way. Indeed, this bill is just the beginning. The University of Chicago reports in 2021 that support for additional infrastructure investment is one of the few views broadly shared by both parties. However, politicians aren't interested in enacting 2 visions at once. List 22 of Bloomberg confirms, with priorities like healthcare and education demanding attention, leaders lack the political capital to reinvent the wheel. Efforts to to improve existing infrastructure can't coexist with flashy mega projects. Fiscal realities demand a prudent approach. Snyder 22 of Politico writes, state officials will only add new projects to their infrastructure plans if they replace existing ones. In the wake of record inflation, there simply isn't enough room in the budget for more. Unfortunately, O'Toole 21 at the Cato Institute finds high-speed rail would require more than $4 trillion in funding. A single mile of track costs $200 million, and maintenance requirements include replacement of rails every 10 years. Thus, the dichotomy is simple. Every dollar spent building a high-speed rail is a dollar taken away from repairing roads, bridges, and airports. This is not a fair trade. For decades, politicians have claimed high-speed rail to be the future of transport, but these promises fall short of reality. Instead, Bolanos 15 of UC Berkeley explains, governments lose track of long-term economic goals, blinded by short-term political gains. Costs are routinely underestimated, while careful analysis and planning are swiftly swept aside. Indeed, high-speed rail has failed across the board. In Europe, Christian 18 for Fund for American Studies writes, HSR suffers from chronic cost overruns, delays, and poor performance. Lines often run at below 50% of capacity, with little difference between high-speed rail and ordinary trains. Looking eastward, Shin 22 furthers, China's HSR has added nearly $900 billion to the national debt, causing the Side 21 of the Observer's Research Foundation to conclude projects are facing the chopping block in the wake of low returns. When projects survive, it's often not on their merit. Feigenbaum 13 of the Reason Foundation explains that high-speed rails all over the world have been hooked to government life support, with costly subsidization the only reason they remain operational. Here in America, these issues will only be exacerbated. The Cato Institute confirms in 2009, our current interstates are 10 times more cost-effective than high-speed rail. Samuelson 10 of RCP confirms, while Europe and Asia have city plans built on public transit, American destinations are too dispersed to support rail service. Such service is unlikely ever to even start. Despite federal funding, Gumbel 22 of The Guardian finds, California's HSR has fallen prey to mismanagement, inexperience, and political blunders. Even with 14 years of time, money, and effort, the project has yet to lay a single mile of track. Barriers to building HSR go beyond bureaucracy. McCardle 19 of The Washington Post writes, developing HSR would require the government to seize thousands of miles of valuable real estate. Americans would fiercely fight back. McCardle furthers, the U.S. legal system allows citizens to tie up the government for decades in eminent domain appeals that kill once ambitious high-speed rail proposals. Buyer 20 of Governing puts it really simply. High-speed rail cannot be built because there is no legal right of way for it. At the end of the day, voting affirmative trades in our current path to prosperity for a useless vanity project that won't even be completed and won't be used if it is. We can't afford to make that trade right now. Shaper 21 of NPR concludes, absent effective infrastructure development, the U.S. will lose $10 trillion in economic growth by 2030, with 3 million Americans losing their jobs and millions more bearing the brunt of negative spillovers. Thus, to preserve progress and prosperity, reject this trade, vote negative. I'll switch this.
So why is current infrastructure even good?
Why is what?
Why is infrastructure that already exists?
Why it's good?
Yeah.
I mean, the state of it is bad. Like, it's kind of falling in disrepair. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't
so-
know about you guys, but the grid up in Northern California really sucks. Like, more than 3 houses can't turn on their air conditioning. The highways are bumpy and it makes me car sick. There's
Yeah,
a
but
whole lot of other things.
I guess my question is why should we focus on replenishing current infrastructure instead of building new, better infrastructure?
Well, I mean, God, they're loud. Well, I mean, you can't start a flashy new project without making sure the infrastructure is good. Like, high-speed rails, like you say, rely on electricity, right? How are we gonna have that if the grid fails every time somebody turns on the AC and the power goes off every 20 minutes in certain parts of Northern California? We can't, how is that gonna support a train running across the country? It's not. So we need to fix that first before we're even thinking about building a high-speed rail.
Okay. So a really quick follow-up, is
Sure.
infrastructure bad right now because regions lack economic stimulus?
Well, I mean, we just tell you that infrastructure is bad, but we're telling you that we're trying to fix it.
No, yeah, is
but
it bad
if we
because-
build HSR, that crowds out all the funding, resources, and time, jobs that we could have to actually make America.
Okay, but roads are probably really bad in I don't know, Illinois, right?
I mean, I don't know. I don't live in
Okay.
Illinois. I
Yeah.
try not to. Okay, no
Right,
offense to
right.
anybody. Anyways, let's talk about, I guess, your green energy oil kind of thing. How do you solve for airplanes and cars? I feel like airplanes use a lot of fuel and everybody likes cars and drives everywhere. I just don't understand how you can solve for that.
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple reasons. The first reason is because if you increase HSR, there's at least a marginal decrease of car use and plane use because it's
But-
able to cover long distances, right? But then
Long
second,
distances, how long would it take? I feel like a plane is going to be faster than a train and a more like, you know.
Yeah, but a train is probably like faster and easier. I mean, not faster, sorry, cheaper and like easier to ride, right?
But aren't planes more efficient? Like, would you rather take a 5-hour train ride or would you rather take a 1-hour plane
Probably
ride?
a train ride,
You'd rather
because
sit
every
for
time I
5
go to the
hours.
airport, I have to go through security. I have to like
You
take
don't
my
think-
shoes off. Like, why would I want to take my shoes off and like check my luggage when I can just take it on a train?
Well, have you been to a train station? Because
Yes.
they also have security. And
Yeah,
you also
but
have to go through all the
It's just
bureaucratic
less
steps
than
that
the
we.
airport.
Really? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. It's not how it works in other countries that do have HSR, like China. Like, I've been to those train stations. They still have security. They still,
Yeah, no,
you
they
still
have
to check
security,
in.
but it's
still
not like
crowded.
the airport, right? But also, the second part to my answer to your question was that the oil sector would see that the government is investing in a project like HSR, so they would perceive that the government is not going to let them drill in the Arctic, which like prevents greenhouse
I
gases.
think
from being
big oil is just going to stop without a fight and just going to be like, oh wow, there's trains. We're not going to drill anymore. We're just going to like lose all our profit. You
Yeah,
think that's
there's
going to
trains,
happen?
but it's
When has that
unique.
happened? When have they conceded something so easily?
I mean, we would
It
say
hasn't,
that
exactly,
right
that's
now,
cross.
post Russia-Ukraine war is like
That's
a unique
cross.
season, so I think that.
It's going to start with an overview on top of their case, and then top down. Everybody? Yeah. Cool. HSR is inevitable, affirming is the only way to actually make it work. Fruit 21 finds that high-speed rail in the United States is inevitable, but we've underinvested for 40 years, and mass transit quantifies that there's going to be 15 HSR projects. Currently, these projects are failing. As Frost 19 explains that these projects are woefully underfunded. That's why Fisher 22 concludes that the way to save money is to fund it in the first place and give it a lot of money so you can actually finish these projects faster. This saves money for two reasons. A, you pay people less for less time because you're finishing it faster, but second, you have an actual system where you can get things done with a lot of federal oversight. This replies to their argument about cost, because if there's high-speed rail projects that finish in 1 year, then you're not spending that much money on construction and labor wages. But second and more importantly, it responds to their eminent domain argument, because there's going to be eminent domain anyways, but the only way to actually make that eminent domain worth it is by firming. Let's go on to their argument that they talk about Biden's infrastructure project. They say Biden's infrastructure project is going to solve for a lot of these problems, but that is not true. It does not apply to any of our arguments. First, on the oil argument, you still have to use oil because it's still travel on highways that Biden infrastructure builds. Second, with the mega regions argument, there's still the lack of roads is not the problem, but it's the fact that they have to travel for 3 hours every single day to get to their work to urban centers. So even if you build highways, it does not matter because there's not a fast transit, but HSR is the only fast transit. Then on the Rust Belt argument, the Biden infrastructure bill only creates 300,000 jobs, but our argument specifically with HSR creates 11 million jobs. Is a lot on that better. With this in mind, they say also the next thing that they say is that they both cannot exist. They both affirming and like this Biden infrastructure bill cannot exist, but they themselves say that the bill has already passed, and if you vote for the affirmative, then you invest a lot of money into it, which means that you might as well try and finish the project instead of stopping after spending however many trillions of dollars that they say it claims. Then they say there's going to be a lot of debt with $4 trillion after you vote for the affirmative. However, there's a lot of problems with their argument. The first problem is from Nopel-Viano 22 that finds that the national debt continues to grow as it has for decades. This means two things. First, it means that no matter what, all of their impacts about losing jobs is going to happen because the national debt is growing. But second and more importantly, it means that the fact that the U.S. debt is over $30 trillion and yet it has not caused any of their impacts means that $4 trillion is not that much. But second and more importantly, the congressional plan that's actually proposed is way cheaper because Step 20 explains that it would only be around $205 billion. What does this mean? This means you don't need to spend $4 trillion. Instead, it's $205 billion, which is a lot cheaper, a lot less jobs are lost. But turn their argument against them. Remember the argument that we tell you that megacities are like the population in the U.S. is going to grow by 100 million people in the next 40 years. This means that you're going to have to build a lot more highways. But if you vote for the affirmative and build HSR, it not only is a lot faster, but you also spend a lot less money. And that's why TUI finds that the government spends $200 billion every single year for highway maintenance. But we would say that if you spend a one-time payment of $205 billion to build HSR, it's a lot better than spending $200 billion every single day. Then let's go on to their next argument where they talk about there's going to be mismanagement if you vote for the affirmative. Dealing their argument because Ho 19 finds that if the federal government gets involved, then we can organize and accelerate all of our permitting processes and shorten that down to 1 year. We can do it as fast as China. This kicks out out of all of their empirics because all of their empirics talk about the U.S. is not federal governments, but it's just a state government. For example, the Texas state government is trying to pass HSR, California is trying to pass HSR, but the federal government actually does it a lot faster, which means that voting for the affirmative is the only way to make these projects actually work. Then, the next thing that they talk about is eminent domain. The problem with eminent domain is that rather than building new railways that that people will be displaced, HSR actually uses existing railways, which means it means that the cost of displacement does not exist because people will not face eminent domain, especially when the railroads are already there. But second and more importantly, the existing railways will be upgraded, which means that voting for the affirmative is the only way to have have like a better future. So vote aye.
Starts on their overview, and then like down our case, and then go to their case. Signpost. Okay, everyone good? On the overview, they say HSR is inevitable, but they don't read a warrant why it is. 3 reasons it's not. A, Jordan 21 finds that there are dozens of legally required environmental reviews which have empirically canceled projects. B, Greenwich 08 finds that there are too many bureaucratic standards and regulations which are impossible to comply to. And C, Greenwich 08 explains that planning has been canceled for several HSR projects from things like noise complaints and other lawsuits like that, which is why Nixon 19 finds that when Obama federally invested, not state investment, literally no high-speed rail was built in 2008. And you prefer all of this because even if these projects have funding, if it's literally impossible for them to build it, then obviously they can't. Then they say that they're underfunded, but again, California HSR has literally received dozens of federal grants. Their argument has never happened in the real world. Then he says our argument about trade-off doesn't apply. We'll get to all these implications on their case, but anyway, he says that people have to travel 3 hours to work. This isn't true. There's not enough time at work to actually make money. People are either like miserable in the big city or they have a worse job in the rural area, but we'll respond to this on their case. On manufacturing, he says that high-speed rail creates 11 million jobs. 1, this is from a high-speed rail lobbying company. You shouldn't buy it. And number 2, and more importantly, the infrastructure bill creates 15 million jobs, which is more than this. Then go to their case. He says the bill has already passed, but argument is that A, we can't spend trillions on both of these at once, and B, it draws political capital, which means they can't do it. Then he says the debt is increasing, but the CBS 22 post-states their evidence and finds that Biden is reducing the debt now from tax sites. Then he says the congressional plan is $205 billion, but A, this is idealistic and it's from Congress. It doesn't look at the real world. You prefer our O'Toole evidence, who uses actual empirical examples from California. Then he says HSR is faster to build, but our evidence finds that it would take 2 decades to build high-speed rail. And repairing existing highways is faster and more cost efficient. Then he says there's state mismanagement, but Nixon 14 finds that the federal government has even more mismanagement because they're not accountable like the state governments. Then he says HSR runs over existing lines, but A, Amtrak doesn't span the entire country, so we'd obviously have to build new existing lines, and B, all proposals propose building new lines. This doesn't interact with their argument. Go to their case. On their first argument about oil, 1, our evidence says that high-speed rail will save only 1.9% of oil annually, meaning that they don't solve. It's 1 week. But second, Bosworth 11 explains that the electricity to power the train still comes from things like fossil fuels, which means we still have to use oil. But thirdly, the AFPM 19 writes that all green energy that they talk about are literally made of petrochemicals and ethylene, which are still use oil, which means they never solve. On their impact about Arctic drilling, 1, Reuters 22 writes that Russia's already doing Arctic drilling. 2, companies will drill no matter what because it's profitable. And 3, AFT opens you can turn it because AFT opens Arctic drilling. Everett 13 explains Republicans will only compromise on high-speed rail if they get the rights to Arctic oil drilling, and you prefer us on a probability because Alexander 18 finds this has empirically happened in California. On their argument about recession, 1, they're painting a false picture. Bloomberg this week, and more recent than all their evidence finds, that a soft landing is coming now because inflation is going down. This is a reason to vote for us because Smith 19 explains that spending trillions of dollars on high-speed rail would overheat the economy and skyrocketing inflation, destroying the economy. On their argument about mega regions, 1, high-speed rail doesn't solve. Solon 10 explains that even if train stations are built in mega regions, people still need to take things like cars to get to them. Second, no one will take it. O'Toole 9 explains that high-speed fares will be 5 times as much as an unsubsidized bus. Third, you can turn because alternatives are better. Solon 10 explains the majority of travel in the U.S. is intra rather than interregional, so urban rail like BART is better. But fourthly, current infrastructure is better. Mega regions are powered by the grid, which means we are prerequisite. And lastly, there's no contextualized impact. 80% of GDP already comes from mega regions, and they don't explain how much it decreases without high-speed rail. But then go to their argument about manufacturing. 1, the sector is strong now for 2 reasons. A, the CEW 22 finds that the $1 trillion infrastructure bill creates 15 million jobs over 10 years. And second, Deloitte 22 finds that pandemic recovery is increasing demand, which is why Egan 21, more recent than all their evidence, finds that U.S. manufacturing is at an all-time high now. But second, you can turn it because ARPA 22 explains that we have to import materials like China to build high-speed rail, which totally destroys our manufacturing industry. 3 reasons this is probable. A, the U.S. has never built a large-scale high-speed rail, so we need foreign experience. B, China has far lower labor costs. And C, empirics prove because Respot 15 finds that China agreed to build an LA to Las Vegas rail line, which is probable. On their impact, Walter 21 explains that reports of high-speed rail job creation overly inflate the numbers because even if one worker works for 1 day, it's counted as a job, which totally overinflates all their arguments and means that they don't solve in the real world. We do with existing infrastructure. That's why you affirm or negate.
Let's talk about the federal government.
Yeah.
So you say that the federal government has mismanagement
Yeah.
because it's not. Sorry. it was not accessible.
It's not as
Accountable,
accountable,
yeah,
right?
what
Because
that
like
mean?
on the state level, right, there are more things like you can vote for governor and have a lot of sway over like local and state officials, but on the federal level, there's so much bureaucracy and very little actual influence that people can have, which is why, for example, in 2010, 2009, and 2012, California received grants from the federal government to build high-speed rail, which, per your argument, if that was true, it would allow with federal funding for high-speed rail to be built, but it never has.
With federal grants?
Yeah.
In California, okay.
Yeah, they've given that, like, we have excellent evidence on this question, like, they've given the grants 3 times, it's never been built. Yeah, okay, let's talk about your argument about mega regions, right? So you say that 80% of GDP is going to come from mega regions?
Yeah.
What percentage of GDP comes from, like, big cities right now?
I'm not sure.
Like,
But
around
that's
70%.
That's not really, that doesn't respond to my argument.
Why not?
So I'm saying that, yes, like a lot of the economy may come from big cities right now, but by 2050, when the population grows and there's so much congestion, that economic growth is not going to happen because there's no productivity in the economy. The only way to solve is like putting people in rural areas to be able to travel to urban areas so that it's less congested, so they can actually have economic growth.
So like, I'm just confused, like, what is the contextualized impact here? Like, you just say it reduces economic
Yeah,
growth, but
so
like, how much will it
the
reduce
very
the
first
economic
piece of
growth?
evidence after the 100 million thing that we read is that megacities cannot succeed if it's congested, and we also proved to you that it will be congested with the 100 million, and we also give you the card about how 80% of GDP growth comes from megacities.
Right.
So if it cannot succeed,
Okay.
then the 80% of GDP growth cannot happen.
But you're just saying like it can't succeed, lots of GDPs from mega regions, and like it just doesn't work. But like my question is like,
Oh, yes, it's
what,
like a quantification.
yeah, like do you have a quantification or contextualization as to how much
We don't have a terminal
growth will decrease?
We don't have a terminal contextualization, but all we need to prove is that it gets better post-affirmative or it gets worse in the status quo, which we have done.
But how can the judges vote on your argument if they don't know what you solve for?
We solve
You just
for
say
poverty.
like there's poverty that we solve for, but how much?
80%.
So you're saying that unless we build a train, then 80%
I think you're asking
of
me like a
GDP
very
is going to
impossible
collapse.
question.
Okay, so you don't have an impact. That's fine. You can make a question.
Okay, let's talk about 300,000 jobs.
Yeah.
So these jobs, like, they're from debt specifically.
They're from what?
Debt, like DEBT, debt.
No. Because the Inflation Reduction Act specifically and all other forms of infrastructure that Biden has passed have been revenue neutral, which means that they raise taxes to compensate, which is why the
Wait,
CBS
so
evidence from this year finds
Are
that
you
it's
saying
going down.
affirming causes 300,000 jobs to go down, or are you saying right now there's going to be 300 jobs that are created?
No, it's not even 300,000, it's 15 million. Right now there's 15
Wait,
million.
I'm
jobs.
talking about your case, not your infrastructure thing.
The infrastructure thing is our
Or I'm talking about at the bottom of your case, not at the top of your case.
What?
So you read an impact, a number at the bottom of your case, and it's 300,000. Well,
That's about not investing in current infrastructure. It's like we create 15 million jobs by doing the neg, but if you do the act, then 300,000 are lost.
Okay, can I
So it's like a net, like
Yeah,
difference.
Okay, it's gonna be our case, their case. Everyone's good.
Give me 1 second. The case right there.
Oh, the overview?
It's on
On their case.
Okay.
No, starting with our case.
Their case, then overview, and then your case.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. Okay. On oil, we'll concede that Russia's going to do our 2 trillion anyways, which means that the Republicans' turn doesn't matter. But at that point, you can vote on the mega regions contingent that says that a recession is coming in the next year and the population is going to grow by 100 million in the next 40 years. HSR is going to revitalize the economy by redistributing populations away from currently population-dense metropolitan areas and more towards the suburban areas that are being abandoned right now, since people can then live away from their jobs and then go to their jobs, which is really critical because mega regions will account for 80% of economic growth by 2050, saving 20 million people out of poverty every 1% change of GDP and saving us from 50 years of recession. They give a couple responses. The first thing they say is that people still need to take cars to get to like HSR stations. We would say that this is still better than if we have no HSR because it still at least minimally reduces congestion and it also increases job opportunities because they can actually take the long distance high speed rail to urban areas. Then they talk about the tickets prices being too high. Their evidence talks about ticket prices between HSR and buses. We would say that cars are probably like way more expensive because if you need to drive like 3 hours every day back and forth to your job, it's probably going to be more expensive because of like the fuel cost is probably going to be more expensive than HSR. Then they say that like urban rail is better. We would say that we have to have inter-regional travel because it's traveling between rural areas and like urban hubs, which means that HSR is going to be able to cover these long distances. Then they talk about about the power grid, their evidence from 2012, we would say that right now there are enough power grids. But then lastly, they talk about how right now 80% of economic growth already comes from mega regions. We would say no, because even if that happens right now by 2050, that's not going to be the case, because like urban regions are going to be overly and heavily congested, which means that the economic growth is going to be really, really delayed on their case. On the overview, they just read a bunch of reasons as to like why it's not going to be built, but we would say that our evidence finds that it's still going to be built after 1 year, because even when you consider all their reasons like the legal repercussions and the regulations and the lawsuits, our evidence still concludes that after all of that, it's still going to end up being built, which is what happens in China. Then they talk about California HSR and how there's federal grants. Just because the federal government like granted California something doesn't mean that California is going to be good at it. We would argue that the federal government is way better at oversight, which means that they're going to be way better at like building HSR than like California, which is a state government. Then they talk about how like our evidence about the 11 million jobs comes from an HSR lobby company. We would say that they read evidence from O'Toole, which is probably lobbied against HSR, but then they talk about how they create 15 million jobs. We would say that these 15 million jobs are probably short-term infrastructure jobs that are really, really bad because it's just like fixing highways or something. But then second, we would say that HSR creates way more long-term jobs because they themselves tell you that it has to be rebuilt over time. Then they talk about how Biden's reducing debt right now. Even if Biden's reducing debt, debt is always high. We've been in debt for the past like 100 years. There's no unique reason as to why HSR is uniquely bad for debt, which means that their argument is totally non-unique, or there's no impact because the debt right now, even if Biden is reducing it, it doesn't mean that like all of these people have fallen into poverty. Then they talk about how the congressional bill doesn't look at the real world. We would say that even if the congressional bill isn't $205 billion, it's still not $4 trillion, which means that HSR is probably still cheaper than like they say that it is, especially because their evidence from O'Toole, which is a lobby against HSR. But second, we would say that HSR is still cheaper than highways, which means that like the alternative road is way worse and more expensive.
Is anybody not ready? Okay, cool. First on the overview, high-speed rail has failed across the board in places like Europe, Japan, and China. The debt has skyrocketed in the last been canceled. That's why they can see that in California, despite 2 decades of effort, the state has yet to lay a single mile of track because of public backlash, poor environmental reviews, and not reaching our safety standards. They all dropped. That's why Obama gave illegal to speed high-speed rail in 2009. Not a single mile of track was built. So even if their case sounds nice in theory, it will not actually happen in real life. They just say that China built it fast, but like China is not the US, obviously. They build stuff way faster in general, but there's also that their government is way more centralized than the USFG, so of course they'll be faster. Take into account all the bureaucracy and all the other like extra steps we have to prevent building faster. Also they also just like can't like the federal government can't really centralize regulations. They've been empirically proven in the past with other projects. Our argument about infrastructure trade-off is clear. Across the country, America depends on infrastructure every single day to go to work, access drinking water, powerhouses, so much more. But despite its critical importance to our lives, our infrastructure crumbles, which results in maintenance backlogs. That costs the economy $200 billion a year if we do not actually invest in it. This recent infrastructure bill passed by Biden was a great step forward, but squandering trillions of dollars on high-speed rail would trade off money of folks with our existing infrastructure plans, which puts the nail in the coffin. They say debt is high, but again, they conceded that it draws political capital and folks away from the projects with funding that doesn't matter. And also, debt is going down right now. Gold dropped, so we have enough money to spend on HSR. But if we spend $4 trillion, then it's literally impossible to invest in both. We don't have enough money. They say highways trade off. Again, highways are 10 times cheaper than high-speed rail because you don't have to build a massive new infrastructure project that spans across the entire nation. Our evidence was dropped. You just need to prepare. That takes way less time and money. They say high-speed rail creates long-term jobs, but no, 2 reasons why we create more jobs than them. The jobs end after HSR is constructed, and also we create jobs in every other sector of the economy, not just high-speed rail. Then they say O'Toole is a lobbyist. This is new in summary. But even if you want to like buy this and flow this through, it doesn't count because he got fired from Cato because he went against like oil lobbyists. He's really credible. So there's no reason why like his warrants or his calculations are bad. Then they say it gets built in 1 year. That's like empirically not true. It's been 14 years. There's not a single mile of track in California or frankly the rest of the U.S. Here's some reasons why our arguments are more important than theirs. They do no weighing in the summary. 1, building our infrastructure project is a prerequisite to HSR because in order for HSR to work efficiently, our essential infrastructure needs to work in the first place. For instance, if our electric grids don't work, there won't be enough electricity to actually move the train across the country. And our Schaefer evidence indicates that deteriorating infrastructure like power grids will cost the U.S. $10 trillion eventually, meaning if we don't repair it now, then we'll run out of money in the future to build HSR, which means the benefits never happen. On their case, mega regions, a big drop. They concede the Bloomberg evidence of recession is going away right now from decreasing inflation, but the turn is dropped to spending trillions of dollars on HSR would overheat the economy, which actually skyrockets inflation and destroys our economy. This means that the U.S. government has no money to spend on HSR, which is a prerequisite in their case, and also outweighs on time frame because it happens immediately as soon as you affirm. Then they say that Nobody would, but then we just want to accept the fact that nobody would take it. Empirically proven, like lines in other countries are run at 50% capacity. It's not very efficient. It's way slower than a plane, but it's way more expensive than actually taking a car. It's just that like nobody would actually use it. But also the alternatives are way better. The majority of travel in the U.S. is intra rather than interregional. If you want to like go across the country, you're probably not going to take a train for 3 days. You're probably going to take a plane for 6 hours. Absolutely, nobody's going to use HSR, even if they win that it gets built. Like there's just no benefit at all. But it won't get built. You ready for grand, or do you want to?
Oh, we're not skipping.
And
Yeah.
selling joke.
No.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Just a clarifying thing, on buses, what did you say? Like expand and no one rides?
Oh, I said that like nobody would ride because if you want to like go across the country, like a plane is faster.
Oh,
like,
okay,
6
okay,
hours
okay.
versus like days maybe. And also like cars are just like they're just easier to access. So if you want to drive a short distance, you probably want to drive. And also empirically that nobody will take it. So in other countries,
Yeah,
flights run out.
yeah.
You still need a car to get to the train station, even if you take the train.
Yeah.
Wait, that wasn't extended though.
Yeah, it was. It's the first evidence. That's the long one.
The first evidence was recession going down right
No,
now.
no, no. I'm sorry, the second. Like the first topical response to mega regions after the term.
So that they have to drive. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
you have
So
to drive.
to travel
We
interregionally.
extended A, the
Like if
recession.
you want to take the train.
We
Or
extended,
like take a taxi
yeah.
or whatever.
We extended the recession stuff. We extended high-speed rail doesn't solve because people have to take cars. We extended that people won't take it, and we extended the term that the majority of travel
I got
is
you, I got you.
You can extend like the last.
Yeah. Okay.
Is that all?
That's all my questions.
Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, so let's talk about your argument about mega regions, right? What percentage of mega region travel is inter-mega region versus intra-mega region? Like how much is occurring inside the region versus outside of it?
What do you mean,
So-
how much is
so-
Like what percentage of travel?
Regionally, like we're saying people are gonna travel from rural cities that are like 3 hours away from the urban city, like that kind of travel. That's all we're saying. We didn't talk about traveling from LA to New York. We're talking about traveling from like Carlsbad to LA. I don't know how far.
I don't know where Carlsbad is.
I don't know either actually. Never mind.
But that's like a city kind of close to LA, right? Is that correct?
It's like three,
It's
like
3
imagine
hours
a
away
city
by
that's
car.
3 hours away by car, but it's
It's
half an
like
hour by
really
That's
train.
fine. I mean, our evidence says that the majority of transportation isn't longer distance or medium distance, it's short distance, which is why investing in like current things like BART is obviously better.
Yeah, most like current infrastructure is probably like short range buses, but we're saying high speed rail's gonna be longer range, like 3 hours.
Okay.
Cool. Let's talk about this overview.
Yeah.
So like you say China is like China couldn't build it. Wait.
No, I said China's better at building.
Oh yeah, okay, sorry, I missed that.
It's not like,
yeah, sorry, let's talk about highways.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So you say highways are cheaper than building new stuff, but if you've conceded that the population is going to grow and we need to build more highways, isn't that the same thing as building highways versus building HSR, and if HSR is cheaper, then highways are more expensive?
No, what we're arguing that highways are better. They're 10 times more cost efficient per
Yeah.
That was
Also,
my
it's just like
case.
way cheaper to repair
Wait.
something than to build something.
No, but you're gonna be building new highways because the population's gonna grow.
Right, but the argument is that regardless, highways
Even
are
if you
cheaper
build
and
highways,
better.
it's 10 times cheaper to build one
Yeah.
HSR line.
I mean.
Like yeah, we also
Like that
we also
means-
talk about like maintenance costs too, so it's not just like construction.
I mean, you have to
Okay,
repair
but either
rails.
way, no matter what you do, HSR is still 10 times more
Yeah.
expensive. One HSR line to 10 highways.
Okay,
You're not gonna take your piece and.
I'll take it now. Okay,
That's fine.
yeah. It's gonna start on their wing, the prereq about electric grids. And then it's gonna go to our case, our overview, their case.
Wait,
I'll signpost. It's just gonna start on the wing.
Okay.
Cool. They say building infrastructure is a prerequisite with electric grids. They have conceded that their evidence is from 2012, but we would say that there are better electric grids right now, and there's also better power grids right now, which means that either way, HSR is going to be able to be filled. But second and more importantly, a response to this electric grid analysis is that either way, if you vote for the affirmative, you're probably going to need more energy, so they're going to probably create more power grids in the long term, which means that you don't need infrastructure, all you need are power grids. With this in mind, let's go on to our argument. Our argument is very simple. Even if a recession is not going to happen right now, we just need to win the fact that mega regions by 2050 is going to be unfunctional, and we have proven that. They've conceded that the population is going to rise by 100 million people by 2050, and the reason why that's bad is because if megaregions are congested, they cannot succeed, and they've also conceded that megaregions are going to be 80% of economic growth. So if they're all congested and their 80% of economic growth does not happen by 2050, we're never going to be able to get out of recession, and recessions are cyclical, which also they've conceded, because recessions are inevitable, but the only way to get out of recession is by having economic productivity. That only happens if you vote for the affirmative, and every 1% decrease in economic growth leads to 20 more million people in poverty. They give a couple of responses. First, they say recession is going down right now. Sure, we'll concede the short term, but here's why the short term does not matter. Right now, we're always able to get out of recession because the economic productivity still exists. They're not congested yet, but by 2050, it is congested, which is why we're not going to be able to get out of recession in the long term. So you have to vote for us now to build HSR by 2050. Then they say they're going to expand. They say something about buses. And they say something about buses, but no one, they say something about how people are going to ride planes, which is a lot longer distance, but no one is traveling across the country. That is not our argument. Our argument is talking about rural areas to urban areas. You don't need to take a plane. All you need is HSR. It takes 30 minutes. Then they say, there is not interregional travel. We agree it's not interregional travel. It's just 3 hours away. Let's go on to their case. On the overview, all we need to win is that HSR is going to be built, and we've proven that. Even if it's not built in 1 year, we just need to prove that it's built before 2050, and we prove that because we tell you that federal oversight is going to make the U.S. a lot faster than state governments, which means that in the long term, we're still going to be able to build HSR. The only empiric is Obama from 08, but Obama from 08 was 08. Now it's a different political atmosphere.
Okay, starting on the overview. If there's one thing their case relies on, it's the fact that high-speed rail is built so people can go to megaregions to take them. The problem is, throughout the entire round, they've conceded 3 warrants as to why this never happens. A, environmental reviews, which take a super long time and are super costly. B, there's too much public backlash from things like noise complaints. And C, I don't remember the third warrant, but it doesn't matter because they conceded two of them. That's why they've conceded that in California. We've been trying for 2 decades, but it's never happened. The only response to this entire argument about how it doesn't get built is just, we can build it in 1 year. This doesn't make sense. They've conceded that, 1 year might be applicable in China, it's not in the US, because the federal government can't just magically get around all these environmental restrictions and public backlash, which is why they've conceded that when Obama specifically used federal funding in 2009, none of their impacts happened. What does this mean for this debate? It means that their megaregions argument literally doesn't matter at all, because none of this argument is, it never gets built in the first place. Okay, so never gets built. That was dropped. You vote right here. Okay. He conceded our entire case about infrastructure trade-off in his last speech as well. All he responds to is the weighing, the first piece of weighing. I don't need to respond to it because he conceded the second piece of weighing. The second piece of weighing is dropped. That because there's things like deteriorating infrastructure like power grids is going to cost us so much money eventually that we won't have enough money to build high-speed rail, which means we are a prerequisite. If you want money to fund high-speed rail, you need to invest in our current infrastructure first. That's why they've conceded the entirety of our link. There is no extended defense in this round. That across the country, Americans depend on infrastructure. If you vote specifically for high-speed rail, A, costs so much money, and B, saps so much political capital that it's impossible to invest in our current infrastructure, which they've conceded the weighing means that you can't actually use high-speed rail, and because we don't have enough money to fund it, this was dropped. It is a prerequisite to their argument. It doesn't matter. Even then, they aren't winning their case. There are 2 responses that are dropped in final focus. The first one is the response from O'Toole that it's too expensive. It was literally dropped, which means that even if theoretically people could use it, they're still going to use things like cars because it's so much expensive. And the second thing that was dropped is that high-speed rail doesn't solve because you still need to, even if there's a train station, you still need to drive to it, which means that A, even if in order to vote for them, you need to believe that A, it gets built, B, that current infrastructure isn't enough, and C, that they're winning their case, which they just aren't because there have been so many things that have just been dropped this entire round. Thank you, and please engage. Good round.